The work of Lois Fitch, following Paul Griffiths, has situated Ferneyhough's practice within a synthesis of modern and postmodern concerns. By reading his music through a Marxist critique of the politics of musical temporality in 20th century compositional practice, this conception can be further contextualised as a resolution of the antagonism between temporal and spatial perception. This allows for a reimagining of the implications of well-documented frictions and drama in his music, where, to quote Richard Toup, coherence is not lost, but constantly walks a tightrope over the abyss, and in which, in the words of Alistair Williams, the creative dialogue between structural determinacy and local contingency explores the tensions of modern subjectivity. Seen in this way, the composer's work gains political relevance to our current historical moment, one marked by a related, though disempowering reconciliation of its preceding two general periods, where the postmodern sense of perspectival multiplicity combines with an older, monad-like individual certainty. Ferneyhough's music provides us with an almost complete inversion of these regressive trends, whereby rigorous yet disorientating objective structures become paramount to the maintenance of subjective freedom, one that's seen as a fluid, dynamic series of perspectives. On the relationship between modernist temporal direction and postmodern plurality, Ferneyhough claims that each can be used to reread its counterpart, writing how history exists primarily within the intellectual universe of the reflecting and acting individual as a series of uneasily existing, interconnected frames or models. Its defining essence is motion, its articulating paradigm, perspective. Linear history and decentered perspective, he argues, are by no means mutually exclusive. This passage gives voice to one of the most striking wagers of Ferneyhough's music, that, just like the subject of which he speaks, processive logic and developmental direction can exist as paradox, multiplicity, and fractured, broken discourse. At the heart of this idea lies the dialectic between compositional spatio-temporality, the tensions between the disjunctive and the processive, or, in the terms of the tradition from which this critique is derived, the spatialised and the temporal. So I'll begin by outlining the critical framework that surrounds this idea, first attempted in an earlier study of Elliott Carter's String Quartet No. 4. This is a rereading of Adorno's The Philosophy of New Music through Jameson's Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. An examination of John Zorn's Cobra and Earl Brown's Navarra will demonstrate the phenomenon of spatialisation at work. Then, by following Ferneyhough's development from the influence of that tradition through three key stages, I suggest how it can be seen to originate in and transcend those limitations. In sketching the critical tools to grapple with this, Jameson's remains the key text for its argument that our experiences under late capitalism are dominated by space and spatial logic, by categories of space rather than categories of time. This theory originates from Lukacs' analysis in his History and Class Consciousness, which shows how the division of labour transforms what were empirically average processes of making into objectively calculable work stints that confront the worker as a fixed and established reality. Creative development is replaced by an alienated space of specialised action, to which aspects of the worker's individuality are separated from one another. At the heart of this is the dialectic between object and process, between movement and its reification. For the Marxist tradition, subjectivity is a work of self-actualisation, a process accomplished in time as temporal developmental linearity. The transformation of that experience into a series of alienated objective instances of spaces precludes the realisation of this process. Instead of engaging with the temporally based process of free subjectivity, the individual's unity comes to be splintered into the maintenance of skills, specialised fragments best suited to whatever task is dictated by that block of the timetable. These are the roots of the postmodern fragmentation of the subject, the earlier spatialisation of temporal experience under capitalism. Jameson's contribution to this tradition is to trace the phenomena through the entire superstructure of postmodern culture, exhaustively determining how it compromises the subject's ability to structure temporal bearing. Jameson makes clear the consequences of what Lukacs had earlier perceived, with spatialisation now at the heart of the postmodern cultural dominant. In this, multinational capitalism instills an all-encompassing hyperspace as its new sublime, beyond the limited modality of our changed, fragmented subjectivity. Now, it's significant that this critique is essentially an expansion of ideas first set forth by Adorno in the Philosophy of New Music. Jameson himself says, almost as much declaring that to quote his forebear's prophetic diagnosis has been realised, albeit in a negative way. Not Schomburg, but Stravinsky is the true precursor of postmodern cultural production. In this earlier work, Adorno finds in Stravinsky an almost exact musical expression of what Lukacs had previously described. That is, the erasure of the subject through the reification of living processes into static commensurable spaces. Adorno connects the traits that Jameson later identifies as the hallmarks of late capitalist culture back to an objectivist logic that he finds in the Stravinskyan project, with Petrushka and The Rite of Spring forming the beginning of an inquiry that reveals how their contentious concern with the liquidation of the subject is directly related to the music's focus on semblance over essence. And this is realised in two primary ways at a formal level. Firstly, in how temporally dependent development of material is replaced by the arbitrary placement of juxtaposed elements within commensurable formal spaces. And secondly, in the ways this arbitrary juxtaposition is in turn linked to the Stravinskian aesthetic's focus upon quotation and simulacra, that is, the severing of historical styles from their context for stylistic effect rather than suggestive meaning. The formal construction of Stravinsky's music is related to a wider denial of history and a change in the logic of society towards one ordered by things, where free processes are exchanged for reified objects. Here we have all the hallmarks of Jameson's postmodernism: simulacra, disjunction, and ahistoricism, all ultimately realised through spatialisation. Reading Adorno retrospectively through Jameson gives a robust critical framework with which to analyse the tensions between the aesthetic and the social across the 20th century's spatialisation of temporal experience, and by extension, music. Here I'd like to add another variable to this relationship in the hypothesis that this phenomenon becomes most characteristic through the introduction of certain aspects of late capitalist ideology regarding democracy into music. Specifically, in the paradox between capitalism's dependence upon the ideological assertion of the subject's ability to act as a free and rational individual, and the simultaneous negation of that very claim through the same system's various ideological practices, as theorised by Althusser. In Althusser's 1970 polemic on ideology, he showed how the reproduction of the relations of production is dependent upon a complex system of interpolation, that is, the creation of centred subjects which assume roles within the system under the illusion of individual freedom. As maintained by thinkers such as Zizek and Badiou, central to this are the political, moral and philosophical dimensions of democracy, in which the acceptance of democratic procedures as the sole framework for any possible change precludes any radical transformation of capitalist relations of exploitation. Thus, further to my earlier demonstration of this phenomenon in even the supposedly linear modernism of Carter's celebration of democratic conversation, I'll now examine the same factors that Adorno observed in play under the system that Jameson is analysing before tracing this retrospectively into a perhaps more surprising example. So John Zorn's Cobra constitutes a musical game which, through the communal participation of the musicians involved, creates a series of arbitrary juxtapositions of unrelated material and an extreme intensification of the spatialised Stravinskyan aesthetic. All of what Adorno says about Stravinsky and Jameson about postmodernism is here. Simulacra in the mask play of stylistic quotation, disjunction in the arbitrary succession of blocks, and through these, the liquidation of temporal perception into object-like spatialisation. This is justified by the democratic, game-like nature of the work, where the arbitrary juxtaposition of blocks becomes a practical and ideological production by the various subjects engaged in the piece, and of course one that directly corresponds to the nature of those subjects. Susan McClary has celebrated the way in which the disintegrated subject, so decried by modernist theories of postmodernism, here flaunts itself without apology, while Kenneth Gloag relates to Zorn's general juxtaposition of unrelated fragments of sound to an engagement with aspects of popular culture and the attempt to relate musical sound to visual imagery, remarking how the fact that Zorn can bring together the music of Stravinsky and Carl Stalling in one statement of influence provides yet another reflection of the wide range of his highly personal and musical and cultural perspectives. But of course this latter is indicative rather than idiosyncratic. Stalling, the composer for the Warner Brothers cartoons, can be understood as a direct development of Stravinsky's nonlinear disjunction. And again, Jameson is instructive in this. Now, like Cobra, the processual nature of Brown's Nirvana actually comprises an admirable attempt to resist reification through democratization of the creative process. That is, by creating a living process which is dependent upon the human individuals involved alongside other contextual variables. And in this way, the piece is supposedly able to accrue new meaning through a circumstantial redeployment of its material, which basically constitutes the work's form. This is justified by Brown's use of material throughout the work, notably certain chords and gestures which develop between the blocks along certain possible trajectories that could be taken throughout the piece. However, that the sequence of blocks is still arbitrary replaces the piece's musical form with one that is in part ideological, and that the participation of the musicians and the event of the piece itself become part of the aesthetic object that is contemplated. Furthermore, these blocks are ultimately the arbitrary concatenation that Adorno apprehended in Stravinsky, whereby the plurality of juxtaposition replaces meaningful temporal development. The aesthetic pleasure is found in the combination of chaotic uncertainty provided by the democratic engagement of musicians and of the certainty of arbitrary succession through the spatialised structure. These two work hand in glove to justify one another. Of particular interest is how this engagement functions as a mask for the work's fragmentary and spatialised conception. The musicians create the illusion of continuous development and transition from shifts in material that is fundamentally block-like and arbitrary. This interplay is fascinatingly realised in the notation itself. As Brown instructs in the performance notes regarding his time notation, quote, "It must be understood that the performance is not expected to be a precise translation of spatial relationships, but a relative and more spontaneous realisation through the involvement of the performer's subtly changing perceptions of the spatial relationships. Thus, time becomes not only space, but a contextual and human interpretation of that phenomenon, and in this way, democratic interplay and spatialised time work as ciphers for one another's meaning, mutually dependent in their joint realisation." Ferneyhough's response to this tradition is to see division itself as a form of motion that's constitutive of identity. He writes that, quote, "Lines of force arise in the space between objects, not space as temporal lacuna atopia, but at the moment of conceptual differentiation in which identity is born, and take as the vehicular object the connective impetus established in the act of moving from one discrete musical event to another." These are the ideas behind the concatenation present in Ferneyhough's earlier works, such as the interweaving of material in sonatas for string quartet and the mobile form of Cassandra's dream song, with unity in the latter coming instead from the energetic gestures of the performer's body, which seem to reach across the breaks in the material. The composer's above-quoted conception that the breaks between blocks of material constitute a form of motion is realised in the wild gestures that the work demands of the performer, the energies of which traverse their enclosure within the various static spatial blocks. While in sonatas, the concatenation works to deconstruct an earlier structure in the work's compositional history through commentary and contrast, in Cassandra, the expressive physicality of the gestural material and the demands this makes upon the performer work to foreground the body as a source of temporal unity, which displaces abstract material development to secondary concern. This primacy of the physical is similarly present in Ferneyhough's renewal of notation's purpose, from denotational record to stimulus for events that reach beyond transcription. The employment of subjective choice to effect its own negation in bodily physicality articulates the beginning of a path, one that will lead towards the elimination of the significance of the subject in favour of a materiality that reclaims subjective freedom in the aesthetic experience. Now, the compositional history of the later Time and Motion Study 1 seems to confirm this trajectory, with its reworking from mobile form as a companion piece to Cassandra's dream song into a formidable work that bears the hallmarks of Ferneyhough's writing in the 70s. Central to these is the use of solo instrumental polyphony, with parameters taking on the form of musical characters that are subject to independent processes. These produce an audible polyphony from a single performer, a highly expressive texture that is marked by its performative, receptive, and analytical difficulties. This division of the individual into multiplicity, alongside the separation of parameter from material, in turn affects the beginning of the separation between compositional process, performative realization, and phenomenological apprehension. Like the blocks of Cassandra, unified by bodily energy, these become now impossibly divided yet essentially and logically connected. Ferneyhough's earlier quoted notion of temporal history's ability to enable a series of competing perspectives can be seen at work here, in how the subjective journey of the work, from idea to reception, fractures into different forms that recontextualise one another. These ideas coalesce in his notion of the figure, a concept designed to radically overcome the reification of musical energies into pre-given systems of meaning that reduce music's expressive and significatory power. But giving a time a unique materiality creates compositional opportunities for the experience of temporality outside the process of spatialisation. These include, firstly, the practice of smearing, where instead of traditional temporal development, parametric aspects of an event spill over into the surrounding music, the logical conclusion of the overflowing of bodily energies and the gestures of Cassandra's block form. Juxtaposition is given new propulsive logic, in that concatenation serves as a background against which a foreground of parametric separation can operate. Here, the spatial organisation of material is reinvested with developmental motion through concatenated organisation, that is, through its own spatialisation, rather than any appeal to an extra-musical ideological crutch. Compare this to Navarra and the preservation of arbitrary material through performatively democratic codes. Furthermore, in conceiving of music, rather than a series of arbitrary, indivisible signifiers, but as streams of data that combine to create events, the logic of division becomes repurposed for the reclamation of temporal experience. For it is through the division of the classical gesture made possible by the experience of alienation, where pitch and rhythm can be thought of separately, and what were previously constituents of a musical object be perceived as elements in their own right, that such smearing is effected. In the method of parametric separation, this is directly related to the creation of multiple directionalities, where the spatial apprehension of time is reintegrated back into temporal motion through depth perspective. As Ferneyhough contends, the figure's capacity to generate multiple streams of directionality promotes the onward flowing projection of multiple or ambiguous perspectives. And by this, he's referring to the contradictory relationship between surface appearance and the undercurrents of residual compositional procedure. These create a plurality of perspectives within the composition. Rather than referring forwards and backwards in time within the piece, the various elements refer also to elements beneath the surface which correspond to earlier compositional moments in the work's history. This counterpoint between a piece's immediate and auxiliary elements give new dimensions to temporal movement. In this, I recognise not only the influence of, but an answer to, the impossibly large hyperspace detailed by Jameson. It's crucial that this multidimensionality is achieved not by tacking the work to an external intertextuality, but through the objective primacy of the material, the score's relationship to itself, to its own history. I believe this correspondence is of equal or greater importance than that between the work and the listener, and that this is what gives such music its objective rather than objectivized quality. Compare this to the ideology of Cobra, where the maintenance and incorporation of its participating subjects are used as the work's justification, which in turn reproduces late capitalist spatialized temporality. Relating the work to itself gives a multidimensionality of time's movement, an abundance of pathways through the music for the listener to take. A subjective freedom. Here too, in the anticipation of the music's perception, Ferneyhough intervenes through the concept of temporal tactility, or the subjective apprehension of time as a physical presence through density, or the subjective apprehension of time as a physical presence, through density of musical information and the relationships established between hierarchic levels. And this is affected through the relationship between the body and the physicality of the material and its notation. Fitch argues that together these three characteristics, polyphony, complexity, and gestural demands, produce a music that is mediated specifically between the bodies of the listener and the performer, with their subjectivity surpassed in a physical material experience created by the pressures of the performance. This is drawn from a metaphor for the same industrial processes that Lukacs identified in the spatialisation of temporality, where the efficiency of specialisation affects a dehumanisation of the worker, with their actions realised almost unconsciously. Like the establishment of multiple directionalities, the utopian premise of such a process comes from its service in the emergence of a physicality, perhaps even a sense of subjectivity from the musical material itself. As Ferneyhough puts it, the idea of the figure seen as a constructive and purposive reformulation of the gesture should clear the path, the visionary ideal of a work entering into conversation with the listener as if it were another aware subject. Fitch sees this as the elusive something within the composer's music that escapes conceptualization, which is at the same time like a body. This means that it's possible to contextualize the complexity of Ferneyhough and certain other composers within the appearance of new philosophical materialisms, particularly what Timothy Morton has referred to as the age of hyperobjects, objects too large to be perceived by any single consciousness, such as global capitalism and climate change. As well as contextualizing him within the slightly older ascendance of the symbolic over the subjective, in the way that the limitless possibilities of the symbolic material of the score are leveraged against the enclosed, interpolated limits of the individual. Ferneyhough's contribution to this is his creation of a relationship where the radical materiality of the score works directly with the body to overcome given forms of experience, and in doing so incorporates free subjectivity as a vital part of the aesthetic event. Thus, through the composer's exploration of the possibilities of the materiality of music and notation and their intersection with the body through performative challenges and the extremities of our receptive abilities, we're taken beyond the limits of our historical conditioning to a parallel universe where spatialisation and temporality, plurality and direction, multiplicity and meaning may coexist. It attests that the contemporary denial of immutable dialectical engagement with a non-subjective reality in favour of post-truth individuality, whereby data is rammed together like postmodern collage with all the heady furore of some pre-war manifesto, was never inevitable or necessary. Thank you.